There's a moment that happens just after you've explained your boundary for the third time, and you realize the person across from you isn't confused. They're calculating. You think you're being mature, reasonable, giving them the benefit of the doubt. But what you're actually doing is handing them a manual to your limits. Toxic people don't misunderstand your boundaries, they pressure test them. They watch how many times you'll repeat yourself before you give up. They measure the cost of ignoring you, and if the price of disrespect is merely another polite conversation, they will pay it every single time. Think back to every conversation you've replayed in your head afterward. I should have said this, I should have been firmer, I should have found the right words, but the outcome never changed, did it? Because the obstacle was never your vocabulary. It was your expectation that they would eventually respect clarity. Stoicism offers a hard truth here. You are accountable for your own character, not for making others acknowledge it. You govern your response, not their regard. The instant you stop haggling over your self-worth is the instant your authority begins to restore itself. If you're watching, it's likely because you're exhausted from pretending to be strong and are ready to actually become it. If you value precision without cruelty, boundaries without resentment, and discipline without theatricality, you've found your community. Consider subscribing, not as a favor to this channel, but as a promise to the version of yourself that refuses to live on the defensive any longer. Disrespect is rarely an accident. It is a diagnostic tool. When someone repeatedly interrupts you, makes you the punchline in front of others, dismisses your input, or gently pushes your limits in incremental ways, they are not being careless. They are gathering intel. They are asking a silent question without ever voicing it. How much can I get away with? And your response becomes the answer recorded in their memory. Most of us interpret disrespect as emotional, something born of anger or misunderstanding. Sometimes it is, but often it's strategic. It's a probe, a low-stakes push to measure resistance. No resistance means the next push comes harder. Recall the last time someone crossed a line. Maybe they talked over you in a discussion. Maybe they mocked something you genuinely care about. Maybe they made you feel invisible in a room full of people. What did you do? Did you feel the heat rise in your chest and fire back? Did you try to calmly reason with them, hoping logic would land? Or did you look away and stay silent, hoping the moment would dissolve? Every reaction is data. Anger signals emotional investment. Silence signals fear of conflict. Elaborate explanations signal a need for approval. And needing approval is the easiest handle for others to grip. The pain you carry from these moments isn't just the insult itself, it's the narrative you attach to it. That narrative fuels your reaction, and your reaction becomes the map they follow. Need is leverage. The second someone detects that you require their validation to feel worthy, the power shifts. You may believe that if you can just articulate your position perfectly, they'll finally see you. But if respect were a matter of articulation, it would have arrived by now. When you over-explain, you aren't reinforcing your boundary. You are softening it. You're communicating unintentionally that your limit is negotiable. That's why the pattern persists. It's not confusion, it's feedback. The more predictably you react, the more predictable you become, and predictability hands the controls to the other person. This is where a quiet internal shift begins. Instead of reacting like someone being tested, you start observing like the one administering the test. You begin noticing patterns. You stop asking, "Why are they treating me this way?" and start asking, "What are they trying to gain?" Here, attention, dominance, entertainment. Once you identify the pattern, your emotional temperature drops. You're no longer trapped inside the moment, you're outside it, studying it. When you pause, even for 3 seconds, you interrupt the experiment. You stop providing instant data. There is power in that pause, not aggressive power, quiet power, the kind that needs no applause. When someone delivers a cutting remark and you don't rush to defend, something shifts. You're not submitting, you're evaluating. You're deciding if that comment even deserves entry into your awareness. When you truly understand that, disrespect loses its sting. It becomes information, not injury. You start seeing that the person testing you is revealing themselves, not defining you. Yet the discomfort lingers because sometimes their words land near a bruise you already carry. That's why certain remarks cut deep while others bounce off. Carl Jung observed that what irritates us in others often leads us to an understanding of ourselves. When disrespect hits a nerve, it's frequently touching something unhealed within you. Recognizing that isn't weakness, it's clarity. If you know where your tender spots are, you become much harder to manipulate. You stop reacting from surprise. You respond from awareness. So the real transformation isn't about crafting better comebacks. It's about altering your internal posture. You stop entering interactions hoping to be validated. You stop assuming fairness will shield you. You begin seeing social exchanges as currents of energy. When someone disrespects you, they're proposing a transaction. They provoke, hoping to purchase a reaction. If you give them anger, apology, or desperation, the deal is done. They feel powerful. But when you respond with quiet observation or plain facts, the transaction fails. The energy they expected doesn't arrive. That absence speaks louder than any argument ever could. This doesn't mean becoming cold or unkind. It means becoming deliberate. You choose when to engage and when to disengage. You answer with clarity, not with heat. If someone says you never contribute, you state what you've done. If someone says you're too sensitive, you acknowledge their viewpoint without adopting it. You don't try to convince, you don't try to win, you hold your ground quietly. Over time, this consistency alters how you're perceived. The test loses its reward, and this is where the deeper theme surfaces. Disrespect only continues where it finds access. When you stop reacting automatically, when you stop explaining your value, when you stop needing the other person to comprehend you, the entire dynamic shifts. It may not change overnight. They might push harder at first, testing to see if the old response is still available. But if your internal posture remains steady, the pattern breaks. You're no longer participating in the script they wrote for you. You're writing your own. The first skill to cultivate is clinical. Detachment. Not coldness, not cruelty. Detachment. There's a difference, and it matters. Coldness is emotional shutdown. Cruelty is retaliation. Detachment is clarity. It's the capacity to step half a step back inside your own mind and observe what's happening without being consumed by it. Imagine a scientist watching a reaction inside a sealed container. The chemicals bubble. The colors shift. The reaction intensifies. But the scientist doesn't panic. The scientist doesn't take it personally. They observe. They record. They adjust. That posture is what you're building within yourself. The next time someone disrespects you, notice the first impulse that rises. The mind wants to ask, how could they do this to me? That question keeps you at the center of the storm. Instead, gently replace it with another. What are they trying to extract? Attention, validation, control, a reaction. When you shift focus from your wounded pride to the mechanics of the interaction, something shifts. The emotional heat drops. You start seeing the behavior as a tactic rather than a personal assault. And once you see tactic, you can respond tactically. This is where calm begins. When you stop viewing the other person as an enemy and start viewing them as a pattern, the chaos loses its grip. Patterns are predictable. Patterns can be studied. Patterns can be managed. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. That strength isn't loud, it doesn't argue, it doesn't prove. It simply refuses to surrender the inner space where decisions are made. Disrespect may still occur, but it no longer owns your reaction. There's a paradox hidden here. The moment you stop trying to be understood, you become harder to provoke. When you no longer need the other person to validate your character, their words lose their hook. Many conflicts persist because one side desperately wants acknowledgement. They want to be seen as right, fair, or good. That desire is human, but it's also leverage. When someone senses that you need their approval, they hold the power. When you release that need, the balance shifts. You're no longer bargaining for respect. You're deciding how much access they receive. This doesn't mean you become silent or passive. Detachment isn't weakness, it's control. Epictetus said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." That reaction is the only territory you truly govern. When someone raises their voice, you lower yours. When someone pushes for drama, you respond with facts. When someone hurls accusations, you examine them calmly before deciding whether they deserve a reply at all. The power isn't in the words you choose, but in the steadiness behind them. At first, this steadiness may feel unnatural. You're used to reacting quickly, defending yourself, explaining your intentions. Clinical detachment interrupts that reflex. It creates a pause, and in that pause, you see more clearly. You begin to recognize the repeated moves, the same jokes, the same triggers, the same attempts to pull you into a predictable role. Jung observed, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Many people believe their repeated conflicts are bad luck. In truth, they're patterns. When you become conscious of the pattern, you step out of the script. But here's the part that unsettles most people. When you detach, the other person may escalate. When the usual reaction disappears, they press harder. It's like pressing an elevator button that doesn't light up. You press it again, then again, more forcefully. In relationships, this can look like sharper words, louder accusations, more dramatic behavior. The escalation isn't proof that detachment failed. It's proof that the old reward system is breaking. The pattern is searching for its former payoff. This stage requires discipline. If you return to your old reaction during escalation, the test resets. The pattern learns that it only needed to push harder. But if you remain steady, the energy shifts. The person realizes that the usual methods no longer produce the desired result. They may not admit it. They may never speak of it, but they feel it. The emotional hooks aren't catching. The dynamic begins to lose its intensity. Clinical detachment also protects you from internal erosion. When you react impulsively, you often replay the moment later with regret. You think of what you should have said or done. Detachment reduces that inner noise. You respond deliberately. Even if the other person remains difficult, you retain your self-respect. Over time, this posture becomes natural. You don't have to force calm. It's simply there. You listen, you evaluate, you choose. Disrespect may still appear, but it no longer defines the interaction. You're not fighting chaos anymore. You're studying it. And when you study it long enough, you begin to see that the real power was never in changing the other person. It was in mastering your own response. That mastery is the quiet center around which everything else turns. Once you build it, the next shift becomes clearer. You realize that detachment isn't the end of the process. It's the foundation. From that steady ground, you can decide how much access someone receives, how much energy you invest, and whether the relationship itself deserves to continue. And that realization carries you naturally into the deeper transformation that follows. When you stop reacting the way you used to, you interrupt their reward system. For a long time, the pattern worked in their favor. They pressed the guilt button and you apologized. They provoked and you argued back. They criticized and you rushed to defend yourself. Each reaction gave them confirmation that the strategy was effective. It gave them energy, it gave them control. But when you remove the reaction, when you respond with calm, instead of heat, something in the system breaks. The familiar loop stops producing results. And when that happens, the behavior doesn't disappear quietly, it intensifies. This isn't a sign that you're failing. It's a sign that the old strategy no longer works. Think about pressing that elevator button that doesn't light up. You don't assume it's broken at first. You press it again, then again more forcefully. You may even press it several times in frustration. Only when you're fully convinced that nothing is happening do you stop and take the stairs. Human behavior follows a similar pattern. When someone is used to gaining emotional reactions from you and suddenly receives nothing, they don't walk away immediately. They push harder. Louder words, sharper accusations, more dramatic behavior. This spike is what psychologists call an extinction burst. In toxic dynamics, the extinction burst can look overwhelming. Rumors may start circulating. Old mistakes may be brought up again. You may be accused of being cold, selfish, or distant. The tone changes. The pressure increases. And this is the exact moment where most people fold. They interpret the escalation as proof that they made a mistake. They think, I made it worse, I should go back to how I was. But look closely. You didn't make it worse. You made it ineffective. The pattern is struggling to survive without the reward it depended on. The difficulty of this stage is emotional. You feel the intensity rise, and your nervous system wants relief. It wants to restore peace quickly. Apologizing, arguing, or explaining might calm the situation in the short term, but it also resets the pattern. It teaches the other person that they simply needed to push harder to get the old reaction back. Marcus Aurelius once reminded himself, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." Remaining steady during escalation isn't about revenge. It's about refusing to mirror the chaos placed in front of you. It's about protecting your own character when pressure rises. There's something powerful about realizing that escalation is predictable. It stops feeling personal and starts feeling mechanical. Jung observed, "What you resist persists. When you resist their behavior with emotional force, you feed it. When you respond with clarity and restraint, you starve it." That doesn't mean you tolerate abuse or remain in harmful situations. It means that during the moment of pressure, you don't give the exact reaction the other person is hunting for. You stay centered. You speak simply. You limit your engagement to facts. And when necessary, you step away without drama. This is where inner discipline becomes visible. Epictetus said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." Freedom in this context isn't about controlling others. It's about mastering your own impulses when tension rises. Anyone can remain calm when things are easy. The real test is staying composed when accusations are loud and emotions run high. That composure sends a message more powerful than any argument. It signals that your behavior is no longer dictated by their mood. It shows that your boundaries aren't dependent on their approval. Seneca wrote, "He who angers you conquers you." In the middle of an extinction burst, this line becomes practical advice. If someone escalates and you lose control, the old pattern wins. If someone escalates and you remain steady, the pattern begins to collapse. It may take time, it may require repetition, but human behavior adjusts when rewards disappear. Eventually, pressing the button repeatedly becomes exhausting. The person either changes tactics or moves on to an easier source of reaction. This stage often feels lonely because you're breaking a familiar rhythm. You may question yourself. You may feel misunderstood, but clarity grows in that space. You start to see how often your previous reactions were attempts to restore comfort rather than expressions of strength. You begin to recognize that real stability is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It simply holds its ground. And here's the deeper realization. The extinction burst isn't only about them, it's also about you. Your own habits protest when you change them. Your mind wants the old script because it's familiar. Remaining steady during escalation is as much about retraining yourself as it is about retraining the other person. With each calm response, you strengthen a new pattern inside your own character. Over time, the spike fades. The intensity loses its force. The person either adjusts to your new posture or seeks validation elsewhere. And you stand in a different position than before. Not louder, not harsher, just steadier. The escalation that once felt like proof of failure becomes evidence that you disrupted the old cycle. You didn't make the situation worse. You made it unsustainable. And from that steady ground, you're ready to move into the next layer of change. At this stage, your response becomes simpler, not louder. You reduce it to facts. Disrespect feeds on emotion, especially emotional language. Words like selfish, dramatic, lazy, useless, irresponsible. These aren't descriptions of behavior, they're labels. They're meant to provoke. They're hooks thrown into your mind, hoping you'll grab them and start pulling back. When you argue with labels, you enter their frame. You start debating your identity instead of addressing reality. And once the conversation shifts to identity, it becomes endless. Instead of arguing with adjectives, respond with what is concrete. If someone says, "You never help around here," the instinct is to defend yourself with a long explanation. You list everything you've done, hoping logic will restore fairness. But explanations often fuel the conflict because they show emotional investment. A steadier response is short and factual. "I did the dishes, they're in the rack." That's it. No tone, no heat, just reality. If someone says you're too sensitive, you don't analyze your personality or justify your feelings. You pause. You look at them steadily and say, "That's your perspective." Then you return to what you were doing. The energy drops because you didn't engage in the fight they prepared for. Notice the shift. You didn't accept their label. You also didn't attack theirs. You stepped out of the emotional exchange. Without friction, there's no fire. Most arguments continue because both sides supply fuel. When one side removes it, the flames lose strength. This isn't about suppressing your voice. It's about choosing when and how to use it. There's strength in calm facts, there's authority in restraint, and there's power in refusing to argue about who you are. This approach feels almost too simple, and that's why it works. Complexity often masks insecurity. Long defenses, dramatic rebuttals, sarcastic comebacks, they all signal that something inside you is unsettled. When your response is measured and brief, it signals stability. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it." When someone throws a label at you, the true disturbance begins in your interpretation. If you treat the label as a verdict, you react strongly. If you treat it as noise, you remain steady. Yet, even with facts and calmness, some words still sting. That's where the deeper layer begins. Why does a simple insult sometimes feel like a personal attack on your entire existence? Why do certain phrases echo in your mind long after the conversation ends? The answer is uncomfortable. It's rarely about the present moment alone. It's about old doubts, quiet fears, and unhealed insecurities. Recognizing this doesn't mean agreeing with them. It means becoming aware of your own inner landscape. If someone calls you incompetent and it lingers for days, ask yourself what part of you feels uncertain. If someone calls you unlovable and it shakes you, notice where that fear already lived. The insult is a trigger, not the root. Once you see that, the words lose some of their power. They're no longer defining you, they're revealing you. And when you take responsibility for your own growth, you remove another layer of leverage from the interaction. Epictetus said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." That reaction includes what you choose to believe. When you know your strengths and weaknesses clearly, you're less likely to be destabilized by someone else's opinion. If there's truth in their criticism, you can correct it quietly. If there's no truth, you can let it pass. The key is that the decision happens within you, not under their pressure. Your calm response isn't only a tactic, it's a reflection of inner alignment. Over time, reducing your response to facts changes the dynamic. The other person begins to sense that their emotional tactics don't move you. The conversation becomes less dramatic because you refuse to dramatize it. This doesn't guarantee they'll become kind or fair, but it does guarantee that you won't be pulled into unnecessary battles. And that steadiness begins to shape how others see you. They learn that labels don't stick easily. They learn that provocation doesn't produce entertainment. Still, facts are only one layer. Beneath them lies the question of worth. If your sense of value depends on constant validation, facts will feel like armor rather than confidence. The deeper work is building a self-concept that isn't easily shaken. When you respect yourself, you no longer need to prove it in every argument. You become selective with your energy. You speak when necessary. You remain silent when it serves you. And your silence isn't submission, it's choice. This is how the pattern begins to change from the inside out. You respond with reality. You examine your own reactions. You strengthen your internal foundation. Disrespect loses momentum because it no longer meets the same resistance or emotional charge. And as you continue practicing this steady posture, you realize that facts aren't just a strategy. They're a reflection of something deeper taking shape within you. From that deeper ground, the next transformation becomes possible, one that shifts not only how you respond, but how you see yourself altogether, because somewhere inside, you're afraid they might be right. That's the part no one likes to admit. If a stranger walked past you and called you something completely absurd, you'd probably smile and keep walking. It wouldn't land. It wouldn't stay. But when a certain insult hits deeply, when it lingers in your thoughts long after the moment is over, it's not because the words were powerful. It's because they touched a quiet doubt you already carry. The sting doesn't come from their voice alone. It comes from the echo inside your own mind. Most people think strength is about having the perfect response ready, the sharp line, the clever comeback, the confident posture. But the deeper strength is less dramatic. It's internal clarity. When someone's words hurt, it's worth asking yourself, what part of you reacted so strongly? Was it a fear of not being good enough? A fear of being rejected? A fear of being seen as weak? The insult simply exposed what was already there. And once you see that, the situation shifts. You're no longer fighting just them. You're looking at yourself. Toxic individuals, whether consciously or not, are skilled at detecting insecurity. They test different words the way someone might tap on walls to find a hollow spot. They throw statements into the air and watch for the flinch. The reaction tells them where the wound is. If you become defensive, they know they found it. If you shrink, they know it matters. Over time, they learn which phrases trigger you and they return to them. This isn't magic, it's pattern recognition. They're responding to your signals. That's why the real armor isn't a sharper tongue, it's self-acceptance. If you fully own your imperfections, they can't be used against you. Imagine saying to yourself calmly and honestly, yes, I'm still growing. Yes, I struggle in some areas. Yes, I am imperfect. Those statements aren't weakness, they're ownership. And ownership removes leverage. When you accept your flaws privately, no one can shame you publicly with them. The insult loses voltage because there's nothing left to expose. This doesn't mean you stop improving. It means you stop pretending. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If someone can prove me wrong and show me my mistake in any thought or action, I shall gladly change." That's strength, the willingness to see your own flaws without collapsing under them. When criticism contains truth, you adjust. When it doesn't, you release it. Either way, your stability remains. The words of others become information rather than identity. Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." That acceptance isn't about arrogance, it's about integration. You aren't only your strengths, you're also your fears, your habits, your mistakes. When you deny those parts, you make them fragile. When you accept them, you make them solid. The more integrated you are, the less reactive you become. The insult that once shook you now feels predictable. It touches the surface but doesn't break through. Epictetus taught that freedom begins in the mind. He said, "Make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens." What is in your power is your judgment about yourself. If you decide your worth based on someone else's mood, you'll always feel unstable. But if you ground your value in your own principles, in your effort, in your integrity, then outside opinions lose their authority. You stop chasing validation. You stop fearing rejection. You begin operating from internal approval. Seneca wrote, "He who angers you conquers you." The same applies to shame. He who shames you conquers you, if you accept the shame. But if you examine it and find it empty, the attempt fails. The other person may continue speaking, but the emotional impact fades. You're no longer reacting from insecurity. You're responding from clarity. And clarity is quiet. It doesn't need to prove itself. Over time, this self-acceptance changes how you carry yourself. You speak differently. You move differently. You listen without panic. The need to defend every point decreases. You become less concerned with how you appear and more focused on who you are. That shift is subtle but powerful. Others sense it. They realize that their words don't land the same way. The old triggers no longer produce the same reaction. This is how the deeper transformation unfolds. You don't silence disrespect by overpowering it. You weaken it by removing its fuel. When your identity isn't fragile, insults become light. When your value is self-defined, labels fall away. The dynamic changes because you changed. And this brings us back to the core idea that's been building quietly beneath everything. The real shift isn't in controlling their behavior. It's in stabilizing your own sense of self so completely that their behavior loses its power over you. There is one internal decision that changes everything, and it isn't dramatic. It doesn't involve a speech or a confrontation. It happens quietly inside your own mind. You kill the hope that they will become different. This is the hardest part because hope feels noble. Hope feels patient. Hope feels loving. But in the wrong place, hope becomes a chain. As long as you secretly believe they'll wake up one day, apologize sincerely, and transform into the person you wish they were, you remain emotionally invested in their potential. You keep explaining yourself because you hope they'll finally understand. You keep arguing because you hope they'll admit they were wrong. You keep waiting because you hope the version of them you once saw will return. That hope keeps you tied to a future that may never arrive. The problem isn't kindness, the problem is illusion. When you look at someone through the lens of what they could be instead of what they consistently are, you distort reality. You excuse behavior that has already shown you its pattern. You downplay repeated disrespect because you believe the next conversation will be different. And each time it isn't, the disappointment cuts deeper. Seneca once wrote, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." Much of that suffering comes from imagined change. You imagine the apology. You imagine the shift. You imagine the breakthrough. Reality remains steady, but your expectation creates pain. Letting go of that hope doesn't mean becoming bitter. It means becoming clear. It means looking at the person in front of you and saying internally without anger, "This is who they are right now." You don't add extra meaning. You don't dramatize it. You simply accept it. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, when you wake up in the morning, tell yourself the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. He didn't write that to become cynical. He wrote it to prepare his mind for reality. When you expect the storm to be a storm, you bring an umbrella. You don't stand in the rain demanding sunshine. That shift changes your posture. As long as you expect fairness from someone who's shown you otherwise, you continue trying to educate them. You keep presenting arguments. You keep offering evidence. You keep trying to win them over. But once you release the expectation that they'll operate by your standards, you stop trying to convert them. You adjust your behavior instead. You limit access. You reduce emotional investment. You respond to actions, not to promises. The energy you once used to reform them returns to you. There's a quiet grief in this decision. It can feel like giving up, but it isn't giving up on yourself. It's giving up on an illusion. Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." When you see clearly who someone is, including their limitations, you aren't condemning them. You're acknowledging the darkness that exists. Denial keeps you vulnerable. Awareness protects you. The moment you accept their pattern as real, you stop being surprised by it. Epictetus taught that freedom begins when you separate what you can control from what you cannot. You cannot control another person's character. You cannot force growth, insight, or accountability. You can only govern your own response. When you release the expectation of change, you free yourself from the cycle of disappointment. You no longer measure progress by their improvement. You measure it by your steadiness. That steadiness becomes your anchor. This decision happens once, but its effects ripple outward. You may still feel emotion. You may still feel moments of sadness or frustration, but the underlying attachment to their transformation is gone. You stop rehearsing conversations in your head. You stop fantasizing about the day they'll finally understand. You accept that their path is their responsibility, not yours. And in that acceptance, something in you relaxes. Life after this shift looks different. You become practical. If someone consistently disrespects you, you limit how much access they have to your time and energy. If someone repeatedly crosses a boundary, you reinforce it with action instead of explanation. You speak calmly. You step back when necessary. You stop trying to rescue the connection. Your peace becomes more important than their approval. This doesn't mean you stop caring about people. It means you stop chasing potential. You relate to what is real, and that clarity makes you stronger. The pattern of disrespect weakens because it no longer finds the same emotional grip. You aren't waiting for fairness to appear. You're operating based on what is, not on what you wish would be. That quiet, internal, final decision is the once. It isn't loud. It isn't announced. It's simply chosen. And from that moment forward, your interactions carry a different energy. You're no longer negotiating your dignity. You're living as though it's already secure. And when that shift settles fully, the next question arises naturally. If you're no longer waiting for them to change, what will you now do with the freedom you've reclaimed? Once you make that internal decision, something practical begins to change. You become selective with your energy. Not dramatic, not hostile, selective. You start to recognize that your attention, your warmth, your time, and your vulnerability aren't unlimited resources. They're high-value assets. And like any valuable asset, they shouldn't be handed to someone who repeatedly misuses them. For a long time, you may have given freely, believing that generosity would create fairness. But when generosity meets disregard, it turns into depletion, so you adjust. This adjustment is quiet. If someone disrespects you, access changes. Conversations become shorter. Engagement becomes practical. You respond to what is necessary and nothing more. You're polite but not emotionally available, calm but not open. In the same way, you stop volunteering stories, feelings, and details that can later be twisted or dismissed. It isn't coldness, it's clarity. It's the recognition that connection requires mutual respect. Without it, the depth of connection decreases. At first, this may feel uncomfortable. You might worry that you're being distant or unkind. But there's a difference between kindness and overexposure. Aristotle wrote, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. When you know your limits, you protect them. You stop offering parts of yourself to people who treat them carelessly." This isn't about revenge, it's about responsibility. You're responsible for the energy you invest and the standards you uphold. This shift isn't punishment, it's protection. Punishment seeks to hurt the other person. Protection seeks to preserve yourself. From the outside, both can look similar because access decreases. But the intent is different, and that intent shapes your demeanor. When you're protecting rather than punishing, your tone remains steady. There's no bitterness, there's no need to explain. You simply adjust your behavior to match reality. You engage at the level that feels safe and respectful, and no deeper. Here's the interesting part. When people realize they can no longer trigger you, many of them stop trying. The reward they once received disappears. The jokes no longer provoke. The accusations no longer spark long debates. The drama no longer gains momentum. Some will quietly move on to easier targets, where the reaction is guaranteed. Others will begin to show a different kind of respect, not necessarily warmth, not necessarily admiration, but restraint. They sense that boundaries are no longer flexible. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy. You don't need to threaten, you don't need to dominate, you don't need to raise your voice. You simply refuse to mirror the behavior placed in front of you." When someone senses that their tactics no longer produce emotional chaos, they recognize that the dynamic has changed. You're no longer participating in the same game. Jung observed, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. When you stop negotiating your dignity, you move closer to that version of yourself. You stop shrinking to keep the peace. You stop expanding just to gain approval. You stand in your own shape. That steadiness is felt. It may not be praised, it may not be celebrated, but it's recognized. People sense when you're grounded in your own value. Mastery here doesn't mean suppressing emotion. It means choosing your response deliberately. When you become selective with your energy, you demonstrate that mastery. You decide where your time goes. You decide who receives your warmth. You decide how deeply someone can enter your world. That choice is power. Seneca once wrote, "Associate with people who are likely to improve you." Selectivity naturally leads you in that direction. As you withdraw energy from draining dynamics, you create space. Space for healthier relationships. Space for personal growth. Space for calm. The absence of constant emotional turbulence reveals how much noise you were living with before. Peace begins to feel normal rather than rare. This is how the internal decision shows itself externally. You don't announce it. You don't argue about it. You live it. Conversations shift. Access shifts. Expectations shift. And over time, the entire pattern reshapes itself around your steadiness. Some connections may fade. Others may stabilize in a healthier form. Either way, you're no longer operating from hope, fear, or the need to be validated. You just have to mean it, not as a tactic, not as a temporary experiment, but as a decision. Once you truly accept that people are who they consistently show themselves to be, once you stop bargaining for fairness, once your self-worth is no longer tied to their mood, the game changes, and it changes because you changed. Do this once, internally and fully, and the shift will be felt. Not because you demanded respect, but because you embodied it. Not because you fought harder, but because you stood firmer. And when you stand that way, toxic dynamics lose their leverage. The rest unfolds naturally from there. The day you stop explaining your worth is the day your life gets quieter. Not because the world suddenly becomes kinder, but because you finally become unshakable. You're no longer negotiating your dignity. You're no longer reacting to every provocation. You're standing in something solid, and when you stand that way, long enough, the noise fades. If this spoke to something inside you, there's another video on the screen that goes even deeper into building that kind of inner strength. Watch that next. Keep sharpening your mind. Keep strengthening your character. I'm glad you're here on Stoic Mindset Mastery.